Alrighty, it's been a long time coming, but we are finally here. It is time for the Chapter 2 lore playthrough. Woo! If I sound sick, that's because I am. That's actually why I'm recording this now. I can't actually properly record with my sinuses so destroyed. So I figured now's a good time to do something content wise that doesn't require perfect audio clarity, since I'm not going to be going off script. Boy, I'm excited. It's been a long time since I played Deltarune properly. I mostly just dive through the code when I need anything. I'm also really excited to have footage of Chapter 2. Having to use screenshots for my videos is annoying. So having the footage is going to be useful for future videos. But yeah, without further ado, let's dive in. We've got lore to look at. I got to get back into the over-analysis mentality. Oh, I hit 2 instead of enter because I'm used to playing Baldur's Gate. Alright. Anything I should comment on this page? It's a cyber's world. It's kind of a pun in that it's normally you'd say, "Oh, we're going to the cyber world," but instead it's got the possessive. So the world belongs to the cyber. So instead of it being a world for non-cyber people to visit, it belongs to the cyber denizens. Which is kind of interesting, considering that Queen's whole plan is to do everything in service of the Lightners. Although I guess in the end, her plan is to become, the queen of the world or whatever, world domination. So it is ultimately her world that she is trying to create and conquer and such. But she just happens to also care about Lightners. So that's interesting. Not much to say, though. It's just her face on the right. Pretty straightforward. Alright. And there's her laugh. Very silly. Once upon a time, a legend was whispered among the shadows. It was a legend of hope. It was a legend of dreams. It was a legend of light. It was a legend of dark. This is the legend of Deltarune. For millennia, light and dark have lived in balance, bringing peace to the world. But if this harmony were to shatter, a terrible calamity would occur. The sky will run black with terror, and the land will crack with fear. Then, her heart pounding, the earth will draw her final breath. Only then, shining with hope, 3 heroes appear at world's edge. A human, a monster, and a prince from the dark. Only they can seal the fountains and banish the angels' heaven. Only then will balance be restored and the world saved from destruction. Today the fountain of darkness, the geyser that gives this land form, stands tall at the center of the kingdom. But recently, another fountain has appeared on the horizon, and with it, the balance of light and dark begins to shift. I have so many thoughts already. Chapter 2. That's different. Alright, there we are. I have a lot to say, actually, about that intro. I never thought about it until now. But why would that same intro play at the start of Chapter 2? It made sense for it to play in Chapter 1 when Rousey was telling the story, because, you know, the Card Kingdom's Dark Fountain had appeared on the horizon of the castle town. But the fact that it appears here at the start of Chapter 2 implies that it's still applicable. Because if you're going to use the same intro, you have one of two options. You either add on to it and be like, a new fountain appeared, and then the heroes dealt with it, but then a second fountain appeared. Or you make the original intro applicable to multiple chapters. What I'm basically saying is that you could say that that intro applies to the story of Chapter 1 and to the story of Chapter 2. It's just that the nature of the Dark Fountain has changed. Whereas in Chapter 1, it was the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain that appeared on the horizon, while in Chapter 2, it was the Cyber World Dark Fountain. So that's pretty interesting, because that would imply that Rousey saw a Dark Fountain on the horizon just like he did in Chapter 1. And that's... Oh. But what's strange is that... Yeah. Oh, that is interesting. Because if he did see a fountain on the horizon, and he didn't mention it to us, that implies that it only appeared after Chris and Susie left the castle town at the start of this chapter. Meaning they left to go home or go to the library, and at that stage, there couldn't have been a Dark Fountain. Because, one, Rousey would have told us, and two, if it appears on the horizon, then it would be literally visible. And so Chris and Susie would have been able to see it whenever they visited the castle town. Or maybe even the other Darkners from that move into the castle town, they would have seen it. So the fact that none of them did... Unless the implication is that the castle town is so far... But that's not what we see in the intro. I was going to say, maybe you can't see the Dark Fountains from the castle town, but they very clearly show that you can. And Rousey says, once he shows up in the castle town, or in the cyber world, that, you know, he sensed a disturbance or whatever. And again, that the way that's written implies that it's a recent disturbance, like it just happened. So, while I understand that it's still debated regarding whether or not the Dark Fountain, the castle, I'm just now realizing the annoyance with every single Dark World starting with a C. It's the Card Castle, or the Card Kingdom, it's the Castle Town, it's the Cyber World. They occupy the same space in my brain. I understand that some people still think that Chris created the Cyber World, and that Chris is the knight. As I've said in many videos, I don't think that's the case. I don't think the evidence supports it. I think the subtext is pretty plain that Chris didn't know how to create a Dark Fountain until the end of Chapter 2, when Queen and Rousey spelled it out. With that in mind, I think, you know, while people can debate the evidence on, oh, Berdly and Noel, maybe they wouldn't jump in, or maybe they were in the computer lab when the fountain was created. Like, yes, there's a lot of questions there regarding the exact sequence of events that led to Berdly and Noel ending up in the cyber world, dark world. But I think the bottom line is that Rousey pretty clearly implies that it just showed up. And unless you want to argue that he knows Chris made it and so he's trying to cover up the truth, but if Rousey knows that the Dark Fountains will bring the roaring, then you'd think he'd be opposed to it. Unless you want to argue that he values the free will of Chris and Susie so highly that he'll let them destroy the world, but he wouldn't let Berdly or Noel do it. I mean, there's certainly some options here, but the argument that Chris did it relies on nobody else going into the library all day, or rather nobody else going into the Dark Fountain in the computer lab all day, and Birdley and Noelle willingly entering the Dark Fountain after it had formed, and it relies on Rousset being aware of it but intentionally not addressing it because he wanted to cover up the fact that Chris is the one who did it. And while I agree that there's certainly enough unanswered questions to leave that door open, I personally don't believe it. Mostly because the subtext, I mean... Oh, and then there's the issue of, there's potential implication that the Queen and the King saw or met the Knight. And if that's the case, it doesn't make sense that they wouldn't recognize Chris. And I guess it would be one thing if Chris, looked completely different. Like, every time we saw them retake control, they changed appearance, or they put on a disguise. But there's never been something like that. Like, I could understand Queen and King not recognizing Chris for whatever reason, but you'd think there'd be some sort of subtext. Some sort of dialogue that you could read into and go, oh, this was a hint that they recognize something about Chris, but not enough to fully realize that they are the Knight. I feel like there would be more subtext and, double meaning dialogue that you could read as implying that was the case. Because if the big reveal of the story is, oh, Chris is the Knight, then you'd expect previous 2 chapters to have lines that, oh, you go back and you look at those lines again, you realize the double meaning. But we've read through all of Chapter 1, and there's no obvious double meanings to be found. And I don't think there's anything of that sort in Chapter 2. As such, while I think there's enough potential here that I can't rule out Chris being the Knight and opening both of these Dark Fountains, but I think there's enough evidence for another character being it, and there's enough assumptions one has to make to justify Chris being it, and there's enough lacking in subtext and double meaning dialogue for me to not believe in that option. So that's all the information I can delve from the intro of Chapter 2, which isn't even in the chapter yet. It was just the legend of light and darkness. Although what's funny is, I do find it very interesting, some of the dialogue choices in that legend. Particularly the way it frames the Earth. Like, it talks about the Earth having a heartbeat and of drawing her final breath. It genders the Earth itself. And considering in order to create a Dark Fountain, you have to stab the ground, it seems to me that the idea of the Earth and the underground, and there being hidden mystical power underground, is a recurring concept in both games. Not only because Undertale had monsters underground, but there's even some context and subtext, and also in Legends of Localization, suggesting that it might not even be possible to save and load unless you're in Undertale's underground. Implying that it's only by getting deeper into the Earth that you access that power, which is interesting. And it adds a further layer of potential inquiry into the nature of dark worlds. The fact that every time we go to a dark world, it involves falling down. You fall down into the castle town, you fall down into the cyber world. I think there's something to be determined there, especially with the way that the Titans form from the Dark Fountains, the fountains that spew forth from the Earth. So I think there's something to be deduced there. I think there's some power at play in the Earth itself. Potentially something reminiscent of Final Fantasy VII, which is a game all about the mystical, magical life force within the planet, with the planet itself literally being alive and trying to protect itself, and the villain of the story trying to kill the planet and such. Yeah, and interestingly enough, the Earth in Final Fantasy also spews forth titans who then ravage the countryside. So it's interesting parallels there. Oh, and if that wasn't enough, in Final Fantasy VII, magic only exists in the soul of the planet. So the only way to use magic is to have access to that power source in some way. You either have to be someone like Aerith, who is spiritually connected to the planet, or you have to have materia, which in Final Fantasy VII is crystallized chunks of the planet's life force. So the fact that in Undertale and Deltarune, magic and supernatural stuff only occurs underground is potentially meaningful, especially since we know Toby's drawn from Final Fantasy in the past as a source of inspiration for his stories. Case in point, Asriel's Hypergoner, as you'll know from my Legends of Localization video, is a direct reference to the final attack of the boss in Final Fantasy VI. So the idea that the most popular and famous Final Fantasy game might have had some influence on a guy who has already referenced Final Fantasy heavily in his own RPG game is an interesting line of thought. Heck, now that I think about it, Chris and Cloud Strife have a lot in common. They're both young, androgynous humans who rely on just a sword in combat. They can't use magic naturally. They have to use external power sources to use magic. And Cloud has an invasive entity inside his body in the form of his soldier Genova, whatever, cells. Just like how Chris has the red soul invading, or something's invaded Chris's red soul and is manipulating them in that way. I guess that would make Susie Tifa and Rouse Aerith. That's pretty funny. Yeah, there's a lot of more. I could go down a rabbit hole of parallels to Final Fantasy VII the more I think about it. But I will not at this time, as I think I've spent enough time on the main menu of the game. So, with all that said, is there anything else I want to point out on the main menu? They're standing in front of what appears to be a dark fountain, because it's blue and shooting up into the sky. It has like a heat effect around it near the top where it's like shifting, kind of like a fire. And you can see their hair and clothes billowing in the bottom there. My theory still stands that I think this is at the end of the game, like the end of the story, rather than anything that's already happened. And of course the fact that we hear Undertale leitmotif on this menu, it's interesting. It lends further credence to the idea that the ideas and magic and mechanics of Undertale are still important and integral to the story of Deltarune. Huh. I always theorized that it was always a strange mystery, the whole monsters not having magic thing in Deltarune. But maybe that's because they live underground in Undertale, that they have such potent magic. Hold on. In Undertale, Alphys kind of steers away from discussing the core, which she mentions turns thermal energy into mystical electricity. She seems to shy away from that topic. I wonder if the core, rather than relying purely on thermal energy, because why would it become magical electricity? We have thermal generators in the real world. And they don't make magic electricity, they make normal electricity. So, wouldn't that imply there's something mystical about the energy source that the core relies upon? The only reason I point it out is because another plot point in Final Fantasy VII is that the Shinra Corporation is using reactors that draw upon the planet's life force, the underground life force, to power their cities. And the monsters in Undertale pull upon the life force and the life... Well, not the life force, but the literal energy underground to power their cities. So, yeah, there's something there. I'm probably going to have to make a theory on this pretty soon. But, yeah, I think that's enough. We can start the chapter now. Chris? ... question mark? Keep in mind, we don't know when this cutscene is taking place. Are you awake? Wait. Is that a knife? No. I think this whole scene is super suspicious. Because it frames it like, oh, Chris was asleep in bed and they overheard Toriel talking. Toriel was discovering the pie tin, and that's all that she was talking about with the knife. But when you actually look at the phrasing of that dialogue, it doesn't really make sense to read it that way. Because the way she says it is that she starts with, Chris, are you awake? That sounds like something that someone does when they poke their head into the room or they're at your door and they're like checking to see if you're awake. And then she says, what is that? Is like, what do you have? And then she says, is that a knife? And then she screams, no. Say what you will about Toriel, but she's not really the type to be super over dramatic and scream, no, like Darth Vader over some pie. And just the framing of that is kind of suspicious, especially because chapter 1 starts in a similar way, where you hear someone saying, your name is, and then you wake up and Toriel says Chris. And it's like, but the person who said the beginning of that sentence and the person who ended the sentence were two different people. So we already know the intro is willing, like these kind of intro moments are willing to deceive us in that way. And Undertale does the same thing, where they show us dream sequences that are supposed to make us think it's one thing, but are actually something else entirely. Namely, when like Frisk falls into the underground or falls in the flowers and waterfall, they get little flashbacks. And the flashbacks can be read, in different ways. Oh, and just the fact that the intro of Undertale starts with this like child falling into the underground, you think it's about you, but it's actually someone else. So Toby likes these kind of double meaning, they make you think it's one thing, but it's actually about a different character or a different scene moments. And the way it's framed here is that it implies that Toriel found the knife in the pan. Like, she would not say, hey, Chris, are you awake? Unless she was very close to Chris's room, either literally poking her head in or just outside the door. But she then immediately transitions to, wait, is that a knife? Which implies that either Chris left the knife in the pie tin just inside their room or just outside their door, which doesn't make much sense. I mean, it's not impossible that Chris would do that, but it is odd. So I guess the point I'm making is that I think that beginning part, prior to us cutting into Toriel saying, Chris, did you eat all the pie, was a flashback. I think that was a flashback to a previous time when Toriel poked her head into Chris's room to see if they were awake. And the fact that she said it like that makes it sound like it was either very early morning or late at night. And she saw Chris with a knife. And whatever she saw them doing with a knife made her scream, no. So I can only see that one of two ways. Either Chris was like standing over a corpse or something with a bloody knife, or she thought that they were using that knife to hurt themselves. Either way, I don't buy for even half a second that intro bit with, oh, is that a knife? No, was about this pie. I think that is meant to distract you from the subtext, the subtextual storytelling here. It's meant to be one of those moments that when you play through the game a second time with the full story, you go, "Oh my god, that was foreshadowing how Chris did X, Y, or Z." So yeah, that's just something I want to start with. Is that I think that Chris either hurt someone or hurt themselves in the past with a knife, and I think chances are the person who was hurt was Azrael. I think this interesting is setting up it's one of the many tiny pieces of subtext hinting at and building towards the reveal that Azrael is dead. So yeah, that's how I read that scene. She really did just slap her face. It is your knife in this empty tin, is it not? Some people have pointed out that the knife doesn't quite look like the knife that Chris uses in the ending of Chapter 1. And it's hard to tell because, there's only so many pixels and we see the knife from a profile or we don't see it very well shown. So it's hard to know which knife it is. But the bottom line is that this implies that Chris has a personal collection of knives. Or at least has one knife that is their own. And that looks like a pie knife. Although I guess it doesn't have to be read that way. It could be a case of, these are your dirty dishes, I assume. So yeah, that's interesting. So small note, just wanted to point this out. I probably pointed out this in the Chapter 1 Lloyd playthrough, but I'll probably have a few repeat point details I want to point out. Toriel has a heart locket around her neck in her dialogue box. Which is the sort of thing that Azrael and Chris wore, or Frisk, I should say. No, wait, it was neither of them. It's the same thing that Azrael and Kara wore in Undertale. So that's interesting. That's one of those subtle details that changed, where instead of the kids having it, it's the parents. Although I don't think Asgore wears a heart locket, so maybe Azrael, instead of it being a siblings heart locket, it's like a mother-child heart locket. That's an interesting idea. Oh, Chris, am I going to have to lock the oven again? Oh, Chris, am I going to have to lock the oven again? Wait, hold up. Are you implying that you left the pie in the oven overnight? Is that what that means? Am I going to have to lock the oven? Is that a thing people do? I understand you need to let the pie cool, but all night long? And normally when you leave something in the oven, you don't want it to cool. You want it to maintain its heat. I just realized that. That's a weird line. Side note, I do want to point out that when you look at Toriel's sprite and Toriel's dialogue box, her horns look very similar. They're not exactly identical. They're a little more curved, a little more kind of C-shaped in her dialogue box or dialogue portrait than it is in her sprite. But they are still pointing the same direction, which is kind of important when we're talking about Rouse, whose horns point in different directions. So, just a small detail I thought I'd point out. Locking the oven again. How strange. What a strange line. Lock the oven. Y'all are going to have to explain that one to me, because I feel like I'm missing something. I'm not a baker, so maybe this is some baker thing that I'm just not getting? I don't know. This is kind of strange. Well, hurry out of bed. It is time for school. And they walk out of bed. All right, we're back, baby. Back in the world of Deltarune. with this super suspicious Deltarune logo right here, with the angel and the 3 triangles. Potentially the 2 lighteners and 1 darkener fighting the angels' heaven. I also have a lot of thoughts about these prophecies. Prophecies have been something I've been thinking about for a while. Because typically in stories, if there's a prophecy, someone has to have done the prophesizing, And there's the prophecy of the angels' heaven, or the prophecy of the angels story in Undertale, with the angel coming to empty the underground. But there's also, and it revolves around this symbol, the Deltarune. But then in this game, it's very clear that the angel and the Deltarune are tied up with the prophecy from that Ralsei tells us about. So, in fact, it might be the same prophecy, technically. Because both are about how, an angel descends into the underground and the underground goes empty. Well, in the apocalypse of the Roaring, the Darkeners all turn to stone, and the planet dies. So that would be another version of what happens in Undertale. So maybe it's literally like a slightly adjusted version of the same prophecy. So that's an interesting thought. Even after a long night, the sunrise is the same as always. There's a positive and negative way to look at this. The positive way is that no matter how bad the night gets, there's always the same amount of good and beauty in the world. Or it's the negative way of looking at it, to where Chris only comes alive and only dives into their true self and their true goals at night. In the dark world, in their mysterious, soulless adventures, it's only then that Chris is alive. And no matter how long or fruitful the night is, the sunrise always comes and it's unimpressed with whatever they've pursued. So you could view this as contributing to the theme of your choices not mattering, where even though the night was long and there was lots of stuff that happened in the night, it didn't have any effect on the sunrise, symbolizing how our choices ultimately have no impact on the bigger things in the world. Fascinating. It's your bed. If you go back to sleep, you may miss a lot of important things. Will you go to bed? Do not. You can sleep in class. What's interesting about this detail? Well, there's 2 things that occur to me. One, when you go to bed, either in Chapter 1 or Chapter 2, you wake up in the dark world. You have effectively skipped past a sizable chunk of the intro of the 2 chapters. However, from a purely meta standpoint, it's a gameplay skip, But in universe, there has to be an explanation for how Chris gets there. But it's only, and I think the explanation is that when we go to sleep, we're effectively relinquishing control of Chris. And so Chris takes back control of their body and plays through their day same as normal. I feel confident that that's the correct canon interpretation because... One moment. Let me make sure I'm still recording. Yeah, I feel confident that that is the canon explanation because something people have pointed out is that if you start Chapter 2 fresh without using a Chapter 1 save file, you still completed. Like, canonically, Chris has gone through the motions and done the events of Chapter 1. However, within the context of the meta-narrative of Deltarune, the meta-narrative is that Chris does what they do because of the player's presence. Because we're controlling them. But if we skip Chapter 1, that means the player was not present for that story. And yet that story still happens. Certain small details don't happen, like maybe Chris doesn't eat the moss, or maybe Chris doesn't, fight Jevil. They don't go out of their way searching for things. They do kind of the bare minimum. However, they still do it, which is interesting because that implies that even without our presence in this game, from a meta-narrative standpoint, Chris would be going through these motions and going on these adventures and doing this story without us, which actually adds further credence to the whole your choices don't matter thing. Because it shows that even if the player was not here, Chris would still be stuck on the same path that they're currently going down. So that's pretty interesting, actually. Pretty fascinating. And yeah, so the idea that Chris still kind of goes through the motions and still goes through the steps of this journey with or without us lends credence to the idea that when we go to bed at the start of the chapters, what we're doing is we're basically saying the player doesn't want to partake in that part of the story, so Chris just takes back control and lives their life the same way they always do. And the player only hops back in at the end. Which is interesting, because not only does that mean that we could potentially, later when Deltarune's finished, we could theoretically start at the very end of the game. And there might actually be, dialogue differences, where people are like, oh, whoa, what happened, Chris? You went on this, 6-chapter adventure, and suddenly you're acting differently. So, that's an interesting, way to integrate this kind of meta mechanic of being able to start at any chapter into the story. And that whole chapter select starting from a later chapter without a save file thing, that's a great way for Toby to further do meta commentary on Deltarune, or within his story, within the game. So that's cool. Oh, and the other thing that's kind of interesting about that is that it kind of gives us a little bit of a more insight into Chris as a character. Regarding whether or not, or rather what choices that they would make if the player wasn't here. So the fact that they still do the adventure in Chapter 1, they still befriend Rouse and Susie, is interesting. And that actually, perhaps most interesting of all, is what that's going to do for Deltarune Chapter 3. Because one thing that's quite different between Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 is that in Chapter 1, you really have no meaningful choices. And this is really showcased in Chapter 2, where no matter whether you were super violent or super peaceful, the outcome is that those Darkners still come to the castle town. Because you brought them all there kind of by force. So, but by contrast, at the end of Chapter 2, who gets recruited to your castle town depends on your choices. So, it'll be interesting to see if at the start of Chapter 3, we have all of the Cyberworld Darkners. I know we'll have Queen, because we always have Queen. But will we have everyone else? Is the friendship route, is the recruit everyone route, is that the canon route that Chris will take? Or will they take something of a middle ground route, where they have most of the major characters, but not everybody? Or will they take a violent route? So either way, this is something that I find very interesting, because this gives us an insight into Chris that we were not able to get into Frisk. There is some lore there to be found with Frisk regarding who they were before they came to the Underground, but the game is not interested in exploring that to any meaningful extent. It's mostly focused on the player. Whereas in this game, Chris is a much more prominent entity. So, yeah, the fact that they take control, potentially, and choose their own choices, and that gives us insight into them as a character, is a very fascinating line of thought. Clothes drawer. It is interesting how Chris has so little to say about this. It's a birdcage. When the door's closed, there's no escape. That's interesting. That commentary is obviously meant to reflect on the events of the previous night. Something I'm going to try and focus on more in this playthrough of Chapter 2, rather as opposed to Chapter 1, is I'm going to do my best to emphasize the difference between the narrative and meta-narrative context of these lines. The narrative, to be clear, is focused on there's some entity inside Chris's soul, a character I assume to be Azrael, and that character is possessing Chris. Whereas in the meta-narrative, that entity is the player controlling our player character. So I'm going to try and focus on discussing both interpretations in the game, as well as, when appropriate, the third perspective, which is the kind of false perspective, the one that, like, the surface level interpretation. So, like, the surface level interpretation is that this is meant to, reference the night before, because that's a very shocking, memorable moment. Everyone's going to be thinking about that when they start Chapter 2. This is what it's referencing. However, within the narrative and meta-narrative, there's some different kind of commentary here. Well, that's not entirely true. Either way, it's talking about how the soul can't escape the birdcage. But there's also the possibility that Chris has been putting actual animals in this cage, hence the blood on the ground, which, being abusive towards small animals is a trait of children with, mental health issues. So it would be interesting if it was revealed that that's something Chris has as well. It's stained. It's your bed. Do not. Also, it's funny how you sleep in class, but it's not implied that Chris takes control. When you sleep in class, that's implied to be that Chris is sleepless. And we know that last night, Chris got up and, went and, did some mysterious stuff without their soul. So they were probably up for a while, which is why they're sleeping in class. And as Alphys will point out in a little bit, Chris regularly sleeps in class, yet is number 3 in the class as far as grades go. So even though Chris sleeps through most of the classes and spends most of their nights awake doing stuff unrelated to class, they're still doing really well, which suggests that Chris is one of, if not the smartest student in the class in general, and that they're just kind of cruising. It also suggests, considering that Alphys talks about how Chris usually does this, that even before the beginning of the game, in Chapter 1, Chris has been staying up late doing stuff, and that them doing stuff with the player is just a recent development. Oh, also, another thing that kind of gets implied by the fact that we can start fresh from a later chapter is the fact that, presumably, Chris still removes their soul and stays up all night and does all the stuff that they normally do, even in chapters where the player wasn't there. So they still rip out their soul and eat that pie. They still rip out their soul and create a dark fountain at the end of this chapter. And if they're ripping out, if this cage has been used prior to the events of Chapter 1, if this bloodstain predates the events of Chapter 1, that suggests that Chris may have been possessed and removing their soul to do stuff for a while before the player even got involved, which adds further evidence to the idea that there is a different entity possessing Chris in the regular narrative that has nothing to do with the player. So that's quite interesting. There's $5 in your brother's drawer. Take it. I wish I had quick saves. I'm used to Baldur's Gate. I'm used to being able to quick save and try different dialogue options. Do not. It isn't yours, after all. It's interesting because the narrator is talking to Chris. The narrator is saying, hey, Chris, there's $5 in your brother's drawer. Which is interesting within the context of Azrael possessing them. Although that does make me wonder, do you think this side of the room belongs to Azrael or Chris? I guess it would be interesting reveal to be like, oh yeah, this is Azrael's side, or this is Chris's side of the room, and this is Azrael's side, and Chris only switched recently. That would be an interesting to reveal. Not only because it would show that, oh yeah, Chris is a far more exceptional person than you would be led to believe, but also that them being possessed by Azrael is why they're sleeping in this bed. And also, it would lend credence to the idea, it would be an interesting characterization of Azrael, Because outside this house, everyone thinks Azrael's super cool and awesome. But then inside the house, this is actually his real self. He's hollow. He's perhaps mentally ill and torturing animals. Like, maybe this stuff isn't Chris. Maybe this is Azrael. That would be interesting because it would suggest that the way Azrael behaves once he turns into Flowey wasn't just a case of Flowey being a monster, but was in fact a case of that sort of bad behavior was always a risk factor in Azrael. And Flowey just brought it to the surface. Now, do I actually believe that line of thought? I don't think so. I think this has always been Chris's side of the room. I think this is all related to Chris. I think this is Azrael's side of the room. But it's a fun little hypothesis that I thought I'd explore for a moment there. However, much more interesting, though, is what happens if you click yes. Do you take it? Actually, before I do that, let me just check my inventory somehow. How do I... Oh, there we go. So Chris has $2, 20 HP, 1 level. Ball of junk. Info. A small ball of accumulated things in your pocket. It smells like scratch and sniff marshmallow stickers. Its attributes of the ball of junk, like what it's described as, change depending on what your equipment and stuff are. And then there's the glass. Info. There's a small shard of something in your pocket. It feels like glass, but... Yeah, the shadow crystal is a very mysterious little thing. In the real world, it's a shard of glass. In the dark world, it's a shadow crystal. But in the real world, even Chris notably is like, it feels like glass, but implying that it might not be that. Ball of junk use. You looked at the junk ball in admiration. Nothing happened. That's interesting, because perhaps that's implying that Chris admires and has positive feelings towards the dark world and the darkness they met. Now, using the glass, you looked through the glass. For some strange reason, for just a brief moment, you thought you saw through your hand. You thought you saw through your hand. Further evidence that shadow crystals have supernatural properties even in the light world. The fact that you can see through your hand is fascinating, as it implies that you're seeing some version of reality through the crystal where Chris isn't necessarily there, which is interesting. Whether you're looking through into the future or the past or an alternate timeline is unclear. I've theorized that it's part of the time loop situation. So Chris not seeing through their hand, implying that they themselves are not here. Let me actually pull up the Shadow Crystal Wikipedia page. What dialogue it gives you depends on whether you have Susie or not. But in this instance, it says, "Oh, you see through your hand." I wonder. Yeah. It could imply that Chris will die or disappear, or that it's showing a future or past where Chris wasn't here. Interesting. It's hard to specify what that might mean at this stage. And then, of course, if you try to use it again, nothing happened. Yeah. If you attempt to drop, you took it from your pocket. You have a very, very bad feeling about throwing it away. Throw it away anyway? No. You felt a feeling of relief. Yeah. That also has, two meanings. One is it could be characterizing Chris in that this represents their adventures and their time in the dark world, which holds emotional significance to them, and so they don't want to lose it. But also in a meta perspective, it represents your inventory, and you'll lose all your inventory if you get rid of it, which is bad. Similarly, though, if we do the same thing with the ball or with the glass, you didn't quite understand why. But the thought of discarding it felt very wrong. So it doesn't even let you. Like, with the ball of junk, you can get rid of it, but not the glass. So that's interesting. Chris, since chapter 1. Oh, and that's interesting detail. whether or not you start fresh with a new save file in chapter 2 or whether you start from a continuation of chapter 1, it'll say something different in that corner. Which adds the fact that that's part of our stats screen potentially implies that this represents who Chris is since we took control. Potentially implying that they were something different prior. Or potentially meaning simply to imply that it's important which chapter you start from. And it affects the narrative, or at least, it affects at the very least, it affects the meta narrative with the player and our relationship with the character. But yeah, it being attack 1 is presumably because we are equipped with the Halloween pencil. And then defense 10, attack 10, EXP, and next. I've mentioned before that it's interesting how Chris has such higher stats than Frisk at the start of Undertale. The significance of that, though, it could just be jotted up to, Chris is older. But it could also be jotted up to Chris having 2 souls, Asriel's and their own, and that's why their base stats are so high. It would also explain how Chris can remove their soul and not die. Cell. Call home. Hello, Dreemurr residents. Who might this be? Interesting that she calls it the Dreemurr residence still. Chris? I wonder if that implies that they're like separated, but they haven't officially been divorced yet. That's interesting. Do not make me come over there. Click. Hello, Dreemurr residents. Who might this be? Chris? Sigh. Do not make me come over there. Click. Underneath the bed is old cartridge of Cat Petters RPG. Caddy and Caddy can be seen faintly written on it in worn gel pen. So presumably that means that it belonged to Caddy and Caddy, and they lent it to Asriel. Although I wonder if that's meant to be viewed as flirtation in some way. Them giving, Asriel a game where you pet cats from the cat monsters. So I wonder if that meant Caddy and or Caddy had romantic feelings for him. I mean, it would make sense since Bratty clearly had something for Asriel. So, interesting thought. On the computer's desktop is a folder called Epic Games Stuff. It's a poorly drawn design for a game. Seems the last boss is a creature with giant rainbow wings. Doesn't seem like this game ever saw the light of day. Yeah, so that has both narrative and, meta potential readings. Because a lot of games have final bosses who go crazy and have rainbows, integrated. They're cut to show how their design has become more versatile and all-encompassing. But it could also be a reference to Undertale in the way that Omega Hyper God of Death Asriel behaves. But it could also be a reference to Asriel himself and just suggest that this was always his OC. This was always what he imagined a cooler version of himself would be like. It's just that in Undertale, he could literally assume that form through the power of becoming a god. Whereas in this game, it stays in a DeviantArt OC. That could also be a reference to Epic Games, who do Fortnite, I think. So that could also be a reference to that. And then, of course, we can go ahead and take the $5. You reluctantly borrowed $5. Yeah, implying that Chris doesn't feel too good about that choice. Potentially implying that in a playthrough where we skip Chapter 2, Chris does not canonically take that money. But that's the real reason that I take the money, is to get that line. You have already taken enough. That could be read so many ways. It could be read as the guilt that Chris feels for stealing from their brother. It could be read as the game shaming the player for stealing from Asriel. And of course, it can be subtextual hinting at the plot twist that Asriel is dead, Chris has absorbed their soul, and so they've quote-unquote taken enough already. So, yeah, the idea that Something people point out is that, oh, Chris is only level 1, they have 0 EXP, that means they couldn't have killed Asriel. But there's plenty of ways around it. Not only is it entirely possible that you don't get EXP or LV from killing accidentally, but also it could be that humans start at level 0 instead of level 1. It could also be that you only gain EXP and LV if you are in the underground. Or, most valid of all, it could be that Chris didn't kill Asriel, but Chris blames themselves for Asriel's death. So even though Chris didn't directly, stab Asriel, maybe Chris did something that contributed to Asriel's death, or at the very least, Chris feels like it contributed, and thus they blame themselves. Either way, Chris is very much ashamed of what they've done to their brother, or what they perceive to have done, and that this could be subtextually hinting at that fact. And with that, I think we've looked at everything in here. I won't comment on the stuff on the walls. This is all... Most of the stuff, I'm going to try and not comment on just scenery stuff, unless I think I have something new to say, because I think a lot of this stuff I've already commented on in Chapter 1 Lorth playthrough. I will attempt to check for any new dialogue, such as calling home. That's not new. A cactus. There's not much to say about it. This could be potentially hinting at the fact that, Frisk was a more, had more personality. They commented on how it's like, oh, it's a tsundere plant, whereas Chris is too depressed or edgy or caught up in their own world to be making anime references. How to draw dragons is at the bottom of the drawer. Notably, the character has a very... they're dressed immodestly. Your brother will never return this book. This is a thing I've discussed at length in several videos. It's implying, obviously from the immodestly dressed character, and that the brother will never return it, that this is a book that Asriel found appealing romantically, aesthetically, whatever you want to call it. He likes purple dragon girls. So, and we know that it's meant to be read in that way because later on in the Dark World, Noelle also wants this book. And considering, her feelings for Susie, it's an interesting little detail. How this plays into Chris's relationship with Susie is unclear, but it is interesting because if Asriel has a thing for purple dragon ladies and Chris has a thing for Susie, then it makes you kind of wonder how much of their feelings are legitimate and how much of them are inherited from Asriel's soul. That's an interesting little bit of potential subtext there. Oh, and side note, this line, within the context of my Asriel is dead theory, hits quite different. The idea that, Asriel will never return the book because Asriel's dead. It's what they call you. What an interesting line. Obviously, this is a play off of the it's you, it's still you, despite everything, it's still you thing from Undertale, which is a really hard-hitting double line moment. But this saying, it's what they call you, is interesting. Because if you read this from Chris's perspective, this can be read a number of different ways. Where it's like, it could be body dysmorphia, it could be, the way that they feel kind of separated and alienated from the public's perception of them versus their own perception of themselves. It could also be, of course, a reference to Asriel, where, Chris is thinking about how they call this you, even though they don't realize that it's not just Chris anymore. And then, of course, if you read this from the Asriel perspective, it's, him kind of bitterly commenting on how, even though this is not him, this is their sibling, they still, this is the body that he's trapped in now. So when people want to talk to Asriel, they have to talk to this, even though it's not him. You know, it's like they say it's you, but it's not really you, kind of thing. Um, and then, of course, there's the meta option of, we, the player, are not Chris, yet when talking to us, they're our medium in the world. So they call it us. They say you, even though they're not actually talking to us, the player. So yeah, there are multiple layers to that. The door is locked. What's interesting is that there's very clearly windows to the outside. There's one in here, so there's probably one in there. But when you look at the design of the house, it doesn't really accommodate the window structure. So that's an interesting detail. There's no time to read books, just generally. Not true. There's plenty of time to read books. That time you spend watching YouTube videos, or that time you spend rewatching that one show that you always rewatch, it's like you could have totally spent that time reading a new book. So, disagree. Although you could read this from a meta or from a character standpoint, because it's pointed out in, I want to say, chapter 1, that there is a box of old dusty books or something under the table, implying that Chris may have been collecting books to read about magic to help them try and resurrect Azrael, and that them saying there's just no time to read books, that's referencing how Chris's daily schedule is too packed with other stuff, going to school and such, and so they have to stay up at night reading because they don't have time to read and research their predicament at any other time. The big red suitcase and the green suitcase are kind of interesting, assuming those are suitcases. It's also interesting how many windows there are down here. Like, there's 4 windows. And then when you look at the fact that this table is like halfway into the wall, that suggests there's like more to this room than we see. So yeah, I'm just saying that the layout and design of this house doesn't make perfect sense. And there's another window here. On the shower ledge, there's a small container of apple-scented shampoo and a gallon-sized container of pet shampoo. The apple stuff is referenced by Susie, who talks about Chris smelling like apples in one of the Noelle blog stories. And Susie likes apples, so later Susie will drink that stuff. And then the pet shampoo, that's the stuff Toriel, she needs more because, unlike Chris, who only has hair on the top of their body, Toriel has hair all over her body. Although the fact that she uses pet shampoo suggests that this is still mostly a human-dominated marketplace, and that, there's not really enough of a niche for them to have devoted monster hair shampoo, suggesting that either monsters are not super well known to the rest of the world, or monsters are well known, but they're just too few in number to have a devoted product. Either way, it implies that there's still a production, that humans still exist, and that they still more or less dominate the marketplace. It's a toilet. Flush it? Yes. You flush the toilet. Yes. I guess Toriel doesn't say anything in chapter 2. Let me just... Dreemurr residence, Chris. Okay, yeah. Nothing new there. It is not yet time to wash your hands. This is a fascinating bit of foreshadowing. And it once again has multiple interpretations. From a Chris character standpoint, this could imply... on the surface level meaning is just, it's not time to wash your hands because they're not dirty yet, or whatever. It's the meaningless interpretation. Then there's the idea that Chris plans to use the washing of the hands as an opportunity to sneak out and go do stuff, to rip out their soul and such. And given the commentary we get from Toriel later on, where she's like, oh yeah, they do this sometimes, That could suggest that Chris has been using the turn on water faucet to sneak out thing for some time. So this could be read as not that Chris was always planning to create a dark fountain, but rather that they were planning on sneaking out while superficially appearing to use the restroom at some point this day or in the near future. So that's interesting because that adds further evidence to the pile that Chris has been possessed for some time, even before the player got involved. Alternatively, you could read this as being further evidence for Chris being the knight, because they always plan to open a dark fountain and they always plan to do all that stuff to trap, maybe they didn't plan on Susie being here, maybe they didn't plan on, some specific details, but it does seem like to an extent something was planned. Alternatively, you could read this as being that this is part of a time loop situation where Chris is able to plan out the specific details of this day, such as turning on the television, washing their hands to sneak out to cut the tires in order to trap Susie here for the Dark World. You could argue that Chris knew all this stuff would happen and was able to plan it out so specifically because they've been Groundhog's Day through this timeline so many times and they remember it. And so they're able to make these complex plans. And then, of course, alternatively, it's a case of the player. It's a meta commentary where this is coming to this fountain is how we progress the game later on. And so the game is commenting on that fact ahead of time. So as you can tell, this game is complicated, and how we're supposed to read some of this stuff is really difficult to pin down. There's so many options. That's why coming up with theories for this isn't as simple as, finding the truth. It's as simple as, it's a matter of looking through all of these really feasible yet complex options and trying to piece together evidence for them with very little evidence to go off of. Most of the evidence has to be parallel stuff to Undertale or subtext or double meanings inside of dialogue or trying to predict the overall story pattern, because the actual hard evidence is so limited. So, yeah, pretty interesting. Anything else in here that I'm forgetting? No. There is some white fur stuck in the drain. There's a photo on the fridge. It's of you, your mother, and your brother. Yeah, that's pretty much exclusively has to be read as the narrator talking to Chris again. Because they have a brother and a mother. Whereas the game would never refer to Chris as a brother. So it has to be referring to Asriel and Toriel and Chris. Alternatively, since Chris is presumably adopted by the Dreemurr family, maybe this is a reference to Chris's biological family. Maybe they have a biological brother and mother out there that they have a photo of. That's an interesting thought. White fur stuck in the drain because Toriel has fur and, some fur probably gets down in there. Here's the oven that is apparently lockable. Go figure. There's some cinnamony batter caked on the stovetop. This is often a detail that people point out because it never mentions fire magic in this description anymore, whereas they always mention it in Undertale when looking at Toriel's stove, which is interesting. Just because, not because of any particular discussion on how stoves or ovens or pie making works, but because just the fact that there's so little mention of magic in the light world at all. So it's less, when I talk about this in chapter 1, it's less to do with, oh my god, this is proof of anything. It's simply, it's reading between the lines. The fact that they don't mention magic anywhere in this household, despite looking at a bunch of stuff owned by a magical monster lady, is the suspicious part. Not specifically that it's not here. It's just the fact that since this is a parallel to Toriel's old house in Undertale, any changes between similar items, such as her ovens, deserves commentary. Cookie cutters for gingerbread monsters and gingerbread humans. This is kind of funny because you could read this as being, oh wait, they do make merchandise for monsters. There's gingerbread humans and gingerbread monsters. But you could also just argue that, well, humans always make all kinds of wacky gingerbread shapes or gingerbread cutters. So, for Halloween purposes, there's probably always been like skeletons and bats and other monster and ghosts and other monster shapes. So this being specifically, this is not proof that there's a market for monster products. It's a trash can. So now its floral scent has increased. That's something that it only says, I think, if you give Toriel the flowers. Because she throws away Asgore's, gifts. Because he is on the rocks. It's not even on the rocks. He is in a bad place relationship-wise. It's a landline phone, but you already have a cell phone. And, of course, you can turn around and ring, ring. Phone's ringing, but you can't get it. You're already on the phone, after all. What if I'm standing right next to it? Does that change it? Okay. What's funny about this, though, is that it implies that when you call upstairs or in the bathroom, that Toriel's still in the house and she's answering this phone, which is interesting. Because presumably Toriel has a cell phone, but I'm not sure we have her cell phone number. Yeah, I know she has a cell phone because you can call her later in this chapter. I'll probably do that just to show it off. And you call her and you can see her answer on her cell phone. So, but when you do it, you're still clicking call home. That's a little confusing. That implies that, just because it says one thing, call home, it can also represent multiple different phone numbers. It's Chariel, the beloved living room chair. This is, of course, an Undertale reference. Looks like it's plugged in, but it's dusty. No, this is one of those details of it seeming like that adds credence to the Chris planned this all out line of thought, because this is unplugged in the previous chapter, which implies that Chris may have been the one during the night to come down here, get the pie, like the simplest explanation is they came over here, turned on the TV, plugged it back in, but they didn't watch anything, I don't think. So that implies they came down, got the pie, ate the pie, came over here, plugged in the television, and then went back to bed. Or if you're a Chris is the night truther, then you think that they then went out and no, there's still stuff to click on. Darn it. Darn. I mean, it's probably not important stuff. I'm still gonna rewind. 1 second. Alrighty. Took a few days break. I'm back. Last time I accidentally walked through the front door and triggered the cutscene. So today I'm restarting from a little bit before that. I played through the starting little section again. I didn't interact with everything, obviously, but I did grab the $5 from the drawer. So that way we're more or less back to where we were. Let's see. Chariel. This is mostly just a cute reference to the same chair from Toriel's old place. Looks like it's plugged in, but it's dusty. Interesting detail, because this is different from the day before. I forget if I talked about this in the first chunk of recording, but basically, this was unplugged yesterday, and it's plugged in today, which suggests that Chris plugged it in for some reason, which is odd. It suggests that they, to some extent, knew that having this TV plugged in would be necessary today. Unless it's suggesting that Toriel came through and plugged it in, because Toriel probably spoke to Alphys about Chris making friends, so maybe she thought having the TV operating would be necessary. Hard to say. That appears to be more water sausages in the back there. Let's see. Can I not interact with this chair? I cannot. can't interact with this either. It's a book of hymns. Hymns being religious songs, I believe, if I recall correctly. Having this out and open on a special devoted little table feels very like it's meant to characterize Toriel as being a very religious woman. Whether she's coded as being more of an American Protestant type of religious or an American Christian, or American Catholic style. Obviously, she's not Christian. She's a member of the Church of the Angel, or whatever they call their religion. But, you know, it's going to be coded towards a particular flavor of religion, obviously. So yeah, there's a lot of photo frames, lights. It's a weirdly shaped house when you really think about it. Oh, and keep in mind the number of windows, because there's like 4 windows down here. There's a 5th one in the bathroom. There's like one in the bedroom upstairs, presumably another one in Toriel's bedroom. There's a lot of windows. And this front door would suggest that, given the layout, that these would be along the side of the house. So these shouldn't be visible. Whereas this would be along the other side of the house. What's weird is that given this suggests this goes out the back. I'm still sick, by the way, so if I sound like I'm sick, that's why. Interesting. So yeah, this must go out the back of the house. The only issue regarding trying to deduce the layout of the house is that we don't know how these stairs work, because they must double back, but we don't know in what way they double back. So it's hard to tell. You know, I've never actually checked along these walls for any interactables. Okay, there's nothing. I guess that would be something people had found by now if it was a thing. But yeah, it's hard to deduce how the layout of the upstairs should work with regards to the rest of the house. But yeah. Okay, I think I've interacted with everything. There's another portrait hanging above the doorway, I notice. There's little action figures. I've already judged or discussed most of these inner household stuff in a previous lore playthrough, so I won't spend too much more time here. It's just making sure I'm not forgetting anything. Okay, yeah. All right, let's progress. There's so many windows on the front of the house. Hold up. There's 2 to the left and right sides of the front door. Those are not there on the inside. Like, you could believe that on the left side, like, you can't see my mouse cursor, but like the far left window, the one that's like 2 adjacent from the door, like that one could be in like the living room area, or sorry, the dining room area, like the section we can't actually access. But the rest of this doesn't make any sense. Yeah, this is dubious. The layout of this house doesn't really make sense, does it? Anyway, we're standing on a little Deltarune welcome mat on the grass. Why is the welcome mat on the grass? Yeah, actually, the more I look at this, why does this house not have a porch at all? The door just opens out onto grass. That makes no sense. This house makes no sense. On general principle. Very strange. Huh. Chris, there you are. Clock says 2 p.m., but I'm pretty sure the clocks don't work in this town. Even Susie showed up before you. Oh, Alphys. And music suddenly. Hey, Chris. If I knew you were going to be late, I wouldn't have showed up on time. Susie, please don't kick your desk. Here, I'm going to turn down the volume a little bit for me on the Deltarune. It's a little loud. Alright. I think that's low enough. Alright. Let us continue. Please don't kick your desk. Treat school property like you treat people. Okay. Next time I'll aim for the vitals. That's not what I... In any case, good morning, class. We have a lot to go over today. First, we're starting the reading from page 142. Any volunteers? I guess I could read the... trouble yourself not, Noel. I will valiantly take this blow of humiliation. Also, what a guy climbing on top of his desk. Also, there's no chairs. I'm just noticing in this classroom. The light world of Deltarune makes less sense the more you think about it, I'm beginning to realize. That's okay, I can... Ahem. Page 142. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Times are pretty good, times are pretty bad. Mediocre times, iffy times, so-so times. Let me double check something real quick. Okay, yeah, I thought I'd give some context to this, because this is actually a reference to a pretty important and famous novel. So it's possible that this is meant to be thematically relevant to the story of Deltarune. This line is an edit, but ultimately a reference to the opening line of a novel called A Tale of Two Cities. I'm actually going to turn down the volume of Deltarune even more, because it is really loud. Okay. So the novel in question is called A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, aka the guy who did, what's it called? A Christmas Carol? The one with Ebenezer Scrooge. A Tale of Two Cities, though, is a historical novel published in 1859 by Charles Dickens, set in London and Paris before and during the French Revolution. The novel tells the story of the French doctor Manette, his 18-year-long imprisonment in the Bastille in Paris, and his release to live in London with his daughter Lucy, whom he had never met. The story is set against the conditions that led up to the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror. It's one of the best-selling novels of all time. It's interesting, because it's all about someone being imprisoned, never meeting their child, and it's set within the backdrop of conditions that led up to the French Revolution, one of the most horrifically violent and bloody and nightmarish events in modern history. And the book opens, with this line. So the idea that this might be meant to say that we're at the beginning of something that's going to lead up to some pretty violent stuff is interesting. Also, within the context of Chapter 2 of Deltarune, Noel does get kidnapped and separated, and imprisoned at the top of a big building, similar to being imprisoned in the Bastille, perhaps. And this is about a guy being separated from his daughter, and, you could say that Noel's father has been locked up in a way in the hospital, away from her, sort of. Or this could be a reference to Des. Maybe she has been imprisoned somewhere and has been separated from her father, possibly. Interesting thoughts, potential parallels here. We also find the king imprisoned in Ralsei's castle town, so that's another imprisonment. Lots of potentials here for parallels. But to give you the full quote, the original quote that Birdley is paraphrasing here, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven, and we were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its nosiest authorities insisted on its being received, for good or for evil, in the superlative degree of comparison only. Yeah, so just reading this fully, the black and white, the wisdom and foolishness, the belief and incredulity, the light and the darkness, hope and despair. The light and darkness catch my eye especially with the light world and dark world of Deltarune, and the way that, on the one hand, this game is far lighter and brighter and full of hope and, a future and good stuff. There's even literally a heavenly angel at the center of the plot. But at the same time, despite being so much more hopeful and lighter in some ways than Undertale, it's also so much darker. We have not only the dark worlds, but there's dark undertones about possession, missing people, abuse, absence, despair. Jevel mentions hell directly. And if any of my theories are right, then the despair is just going to keep on coming. And the idea that this is all building up towards some apocalyptic event, just like how the French Civil, or, the story of A Tale of Two Cities builds up towards a big apocalyptic event in the form of the French Revolution, definitely seems intentional. So that's a fascinating little quote to make. I've never read A Tale of Two Cities, so I can't give you much more context beyond that. Yeah, so if I was more familiar with the story, maybe I could give a greater detail. Maybe some of these characters parallel characters in Deltarune to an extent. So, yeah, but unfortunately I have not read it, so I can't go any deeper with the analysis than that. But interesting, though. It's an interesting literary reference to start Chapter 2 with. Also, why does Birdley's beak look so weird here? He's got little red pixels and orange pixels all around it. What's happening with that? Alright, let me turn the volume back up a little bit. Listening to this, your eyes begin to close automatically. Have a nice day, everyone. Yeah, this is interesting because it's a scene where Chris falls asleep, but it's clearly meant to be it's not a case of Chris falls asleep and then they take control while the player misses out. Unlike the scene where we go to bed. And then when we go to bed, it implies the player kind of checks out, but Chris keeps going. Whereas this is not the opposite, but it's both Chris and the player check out, with Chris going to sleep during the day. Although that does have contextual significance, because it suggests that Chris has been doing this for a while, which means Chris has been staying up late doing stuff for a while. And please remember your group projects. Oh, Chris, are you okay? You were, sleeping all class. Don't worry, I'm not mad, just concerned. Usually you only sleep through the start. Yeah, so it's typical for Chris to fall asleep during class, which could suggest that that they've been staying up late, doing stuff, engaging in mysterious activities for a while before the player has participated. Because, notably, this can't just be referring to Chapter 1, because, Alphys wouldn't say usually and just be referring to one day. And it especially doesn't make sense because last chapter, Chris leaves before class can really start. So they didn't sleep during that chapter. So this has to be referring to the era before the player showed up. Now, obviously, there are mundane explanations for why a kid might be sleeping in class. It could just be really, really boring. Or it could be a case of, Chris is just a regular delinquent who doesn't participate in class and stays up late and gets into trouble. But I'm inclined to think there's a more diabolical reason for Chris being, or not diabolical, but a more sinister reason for Chris having been up so late and asleep during the day. Good luck and rest well tonight, okay? I don't think I can interact with any of these desks. Let me just check my inventory. Oh yeah, nothing new there. Ring ring. No one picked up. It's a bunch of roses. Computer wallpaper is updated. The buff-embracing heroes are now edited to be 4 inches apart. There's dialogue about proper distancing at the school dance. You wonder if your mother had some influence on this change. It's funny, because some people thought this was a reference to COVID and the pandemic, but I'm pretty sure this is just a reference to how, in stuffy religious towns, they would be really, really tight about, appropriate behavior and no public displays of affection. So even at school dances, they wouldn't allow the kids to get too close to one another while dancing. So if they can hold each other at arm's length, but they can't be pressing their bodies up against each other or even getting within I forget how far apart they needed to be, but they needed to be 6 inches apart or something at all times, or 12 inches apart, something like that. So I think that's all this is referencing. It's meant to be that, Undyne originally had, or sorry, not Undyne, Alphys had some silly weeb art of buff heroes embracing, and then Toriel intervened probably and made it to where there had to be some, it's further emphasizing Toriel as a very conservative, religious, anti-fun kind of mom character. Bunch of roses, presumably given to her by Asgore. Looks like motivational quotes from various literature. Try your best, Astral Wolf, even in your darkest hour. That one seems to be from video game, presumably from Star Fox. So instead of astral, instead of star, it's astral. Instead of wolf, it's fox, etc. Chris, this whole partner thing, you didn't lose sleep over it, did you? Ooh, I know you can get different responses depending on what you say here. Let me just pull something up real quick. Yeah, there's actually, I was just looking into it to find out specifics. But yeah, there's actually a couple different variations to this dialogue, both before and during this conversation, depending on which options you've chosen up till now. For example, if yes, in Chapter 1, and this is what happens if you start fresh from Chapter 2, if you don't have a Chapter 1 save file, Chris does not talk to Alphys at all, and so she has no idea what happened to Chris and Susie. Whereas in this playthrough, Chris talked to Alphys yesterday, so she doesn't ask you where you went. But if you, hadn't, then when she is saying, Chris, you were sleeping all class, don't worry, I'm not mad, just concerned, usually you only sleep through the start. Now, in this playthrough, as you just saw, she's after saying you usually sleep through the start, she says, good luck and rest well tonight. But if you never talk to her in Chapter 1, she instead says, Chris, where did you and Susie go yesterday? She then says, ellipses, dot for a few lines as her facial expression changes. And it gets very sus, with the implication, as far as I can tell, being that she suspects Chris and Susie went off to, make out or do something inappropriate, and that Susie's or then that Alphys is aware or suspicious or suspects that's a thing and is like, hey, because she's a dork. So, that's Alphys reading into things. And then she says, if you don't want to tell me, that's okay. I was just really worried about you. If Susie causes you any trouble, then, okay, I can't really do anything, but I'm looking out for you, okay? Good luck and rest well tonight, okay? So that's what she says if, you didn't talk to her yesterday. She suspects that you and Susie went off to do, teen romance things. As for these two answers, you can either say lost sleep from being Susie's partner, in which case she says, you say with no negative intonation at all, ... Chris, as your teacher, there's a limit to the advice I'm qualified for, but if you're interested, I do have a recommendation. There's an FPS game podcast that helps me sleep. No? Okay. And that's the end of that line. The reason I'm reading you off what she says in this version is because I'm going to be choosing this version because it's the more interesting one to me. But the reason that the Lost Sleep version is interesting is because it once again, it gives us two insights. One, it gives us further hinting that Alfie suspects romance, because she's like, you say that you lost sleep from being Susie's partner, yet you don't sound upset at all, which suggests that you and Susie were doing something together. However, because we actually very specifically deduce things about Chris's personality from their tone, we can also deduce that Chris saying that about Susie really does mean that they had no negative connotation about losing sleep over being Susie's partner. So that adds further evidence to the pile that Susie really likes Chris. Or rather, Chris really likes Susie. And then, of course, Alfie's recommends an FPS game podcast that helps her sleep. First-person shooter game podcast? I would never have pinned Alfie's for being an FPS player. You'd expect her to be like a dating sim romance kind of character, kind of gamer. But that's kind of interesting. However, we're going to go with the other option. Actually, my sleep quality increased. Huh? Chris, that's good, I think. So maybe you were just staying up late, talking to Azrael online again? And there's the line. What a funny little detail. What this suggests is that Chris has been spoken to about their habit of staying up late, doing something, and the excuse they've given. So, like, there's a couple ways this can be read, right? Either A, Alfie's asked Chris in the past why they were sleeping in class, and the answer was they stay up late talking to Azrael online. Or Toriel inquired about this, and that was the excuse Chris gave her, and she told that to Alfie's. Either way, this suggests that Chris is telling the adults in their life that they are staying up late talking to Azrael online, and that's why they are sleeping a lot during class. It's because, everyone thinks that's what Chris is up to. However, talking to Azrael online suggests using the computer to chat with Azrael, either in a, Discord kind of way where you're talking, in text, or potentially in a video chat kind of way. Either way, it suggests that Chris is using their computer to talk to Azrael rather than using their cell phone, which is interesting because it implies, since Chris does have a cell phone, that Azrael does not have a cell phone. This detail is further supported later on when Burger Pants, who has a cell phone, asks Chris to pass along a message to Azrael, which is something that wouldn't make sense unless Burger Pants specifically cannot contact Azrael with his phone. And that wouldn't make sense, because Burger Pants and Azrael were friends. They hung out together. So it makes sense that Azrael would have his phone number. But Azrael doesn't have a phone. And as I pointed out earlier, it doesn't make sense for Toriel to not give her firstborn child a phone. So that suggests to me that either there's some convenient reason why, Azrael lost his phone, it broke, oopsies, now no one can contact him, or, more likely, in my opinion, and more in line with the plot of my theories, is that Azrael has a phone, but Azrael is dead. And so Chris had to come up with some explanation for why they were still in contact with Azrael and no one could contact him. Because Toriel's too much of a helicopter parent to not be contacting Azrael on the regular. Like, we've seen how she behaves. Like, she is very involved with her kids' lives. She literally holds Chris's hand and walks them into the school. So the idea that she'd be okay with Azrael, being out of touch entirely makes no sense. She would have to have some line of communication open with Azrael. So, but if Azrael's dead, Chris couldn't allow her to talk to him, because she couldn't. So Chris would have to come up with some explanation for why Azrael can only contact them digitally, through text, through the computer, or through email, something like that. And it would have to be, Azrael lost his phone, or it broke, or something. And so he's only able to talk to us through his computer. And that's why everyone seems to think that Chris is the only one who can talk to Azrael, because presumably Toriel is still not very good at technology. Given her characterization, both in this game and in the previous game, Toriel do not do the technology very well. So it's likely that she either doesn't know how to use email, or she does, but she's not like knowledgeable enough or capable enough to actually realize that the Asriel that she's talking to on in the email could be a fake, could be an imposter, which is what I suspect is the case. That Chris, due to having access to Asriel's computer, is able to log into Asriel's email and contact Toriel and pretend to be alive, pretend to be a living Asriel. And that's why Toriel seems to talk to everyone about the Asriel and her family. So it seems to have spread around town that Asriel is not reachable by phone. And this explanation probably had to be spread because Asriel was so popular. The reason that everyone's like, oh, Chris is the only one talking to them is because Chris is the only one with their email. Yet Asriel was super popular. So Asriel presumably gave out his phone number to a lot of people, a lot of friends. So it makes sense that the explanation that, oh, Asriel can only contact y'all through Chris's email or through contacting Chris in email form, it has become common knowledge. That's why, Burger Pants knows, that's why Alfie's knows, etc. Because Asriel was just too prominent of a figure in the town. So, yeah, that's the way I read this sort of thing. Because it's the only setup that really makes a ton of sense in my head. Because, what else is the explanation for this? If you say Asriel's still alive, then the only explanation is, oops, Asriel lost his phone somehow. And it conveniently cut him out of the plot. So it would basically say Asriel's not involved in the story through sheer happenstance. Through sheer coinkydink. He can't be contacted or talked to in any way, shape, or form. Which seems like a weak explanation. And then there's the whole thing of talking to Asriel online. And yet, this is being used as an explanation for why Chris is up so late. But, as Hafiz is about to point out, wait, you can't do that, right? I hope the internet gets fixed soon. The internet has been down for an unspecified amount of time. We don't know how long, but there's a decent chance that it's been down since before the player took control. Which means that Chris has been sleeping, quite possibly Chris has been sleeping in class and staying up late, even during times when it wasn't possible to be talking to Asriel. Which means there has to be some other explanation for it. They have to be doing something else. Potentially, potentially researching magic, or going about soulless, or doing some other, secret shenanigans. Because, even if you don't agree with my theory that Asriel's dead, you do have to come up with some explanation for why they're laying the groundwork for all this stuff surrounding Asriel's phone or Asriel's email or being able to contact him or not being able to contact him and all this stuff. Because, Toriel in Chapter 1, they mention, oh yeah, Asriel's coming home soon, implying that she's been in contact with him. But as we've just now showcased, Asriel can't be contacted through the phone. You have to use the online. So how could Toriel have been in contact with him to learn that he's coming home soon? And it's like, well, it's got to be through the email, something that could be easily falsified. Because Toriel is definitely the type to fall for some sort of Nigerian prince scam. So her being tricked by her own child seems much more feasible. Anyway, just some thoughts that I've got on this whole topic. I don't want to revert into my primal form. This is just a joke about how Alfies without access to the internet would, go bonkers and turn into a savage, I guess. I don't know. It's just some geek joke. Chris, get a good sleep tonight, okay? But yeah, so it's interesting. You check the time. It seems to not be time for class. How cheeky. So yeah. And, obviously you can come up with all sorts of mundane explanations for some of this stuff. But it sort of gets to the point where you're like, why bother with all these convoluted explanations for why Asriel can't be contacted? Only to be like, oh, there was no plot twist. There's no reason for it. Unless it was specifically meant to be subverting your expectations in some way, but I don't really buy that. So, yeah, in short, I find this to be very much subtext hinting at Asriel's fate. Anyway, let us progress. It's her. It's Barney the dinosaur. Well, look who it is. The school zombie. Ironic, since we've seen Chris, lumbering about without their heart, seemingly in a less functional state than they are when they have their soul, suggesting an almost like they're, zombie-like. They're lower functioning without their soul. You were sleeping like a corpse all class. Of course, in actuality, Susie's just referring to how Chris, slept really hard. Also, her saying you were sleeping like a corpse suggests that, Chris slept really hard. Like, they didn't just doze off a little because the class was boring. It sounds like Chris was super sleep deprived and was out like a light, just doom, head on table, off to, REM sleep land, so that suggests Chris not only was up late, but was up really late. Like, was off doing who God knows what, and got little to no sleep. Or it could argue that maybe they weren't up super late, but that taking their soul out and doing stuff drains them super hardcore physically, which leaves them super exhausted afterward. That would also make sense, especially since we have no evidence of Chris doing anything other than eating pie and potentially plugging in a TV. It would suggest that, if they weren't up super late doing stuff and they just did a couple things, then maybe it's just the act of removing their soul and moving about without it that drains them and leaves them so tired. Had trouble going Betty by last night? Heh. She's trying to be all cool and kind of rude. And it's like, me too, Chris. She's such a goober. Like, I could sleep after yesterday. Just waiting for today felt like years. Oh, shut up. And this is a meta joke because it took years to get chapter 2. Did all that stuff really happen? Lancer, Ralsei, everyone, are they still? Look at her long face. Her face is so long. You have a big old snout. Like, God, it's so hard to draw Susie's face in pixel art because it's so weirdly shaped. You got a lima bean face, Susie. Look, you've been wondering the same thing, right? Come on already. Oh. All right, Chris, this is it. Moment of truth. Everything we've been waiting for is just behind this. Also, Susie comparing Chris to a corpse when we're just talking about the subtext surrounding Asriel being dead, also kind of funny. If we open this and there's nothing inside, will we still be... Screw it, let's just open it already. This is a cute little character moment. It hints at how Susie's worried that if their little adventure didn't really happen, will she and Chris still be friends? Because she's a deeply lonely character at heart. Susie? Yeah? Noelle, hey! What the hell are you doing here? Sorry to bother you, but, Bradley and I were going to the library to do some research for our group projects, and if it's okay, would you want to come too? Look at her cute little face. She's so cute. I love, Noelle may not be my favorite character from a writing standpoint, but she does have just a really cute design. I'll give her that. Certainly better than Lima Bean Susie over here. God, I'm bitter. The bitterness of a fan artist. Oh, Chris, you can come too, I mean. I mean, we're like busy with Chris, help me out here. What do we say? Hanging out alone in the closet, crime. I always do crime because it's really funny. We're gonna do crime, gonna go to jail. It sucks. Very funny. But hanging out alone in the closet is the one I usually don't go with, so we'll go with that one today. You know, just chilling out alone in the closet. Just two friends chilling out in the closet like normal. Adding further romantic subtext. Touching brooms and stuff. I'm not touching that one. Y'all can deduce the freaking subtext yourselves. Oh, well, that sounds just have fun, you two. I'll be at the library. Chris, if you could bring her by later, it would mean a lot to me. It's really funny because even though there's like heavy romantic subtext there with Susie and Chris, especially with that answer, it's like Noelle seems unthreatened. She's not worried. When Birdley's like, "Oh, I got a crush on Susie," Noelle chokes him out and like snaps her over her knee like a twig. Not really, but kinda. Whereas Chris hanging out with Susie in the closet touching brooms is not something that worries her at all, which suggests either A, she thinks Susie and Chris still have a pretty hostile relationship, or B, she does not think Chris has romantic interests or capabilities of any sort. That's the only explanation I can come up with. Susie, I have something for you. Okay, see you, bye. Look at that blushing Susie. Susie's eye color is really confusing, by the way, because like right here it's orange, but at other times it'll be depicted as white. So it's like, does she have white iris, like white sclera and then like orange irises? Or orange sclera and white irises? Or like, what's going on there? Susie. It's a lunchbox? She's been watching too much anime. Look at that. Look at that sprite. That's adorable. Full of chalk. She had chalk the whole time and didn't give it to Alphys. It's such a funny thought. Like, it's so absurd to give Susie chalk because Noelle thinks she eats chalk. Because she does. Whether Susie can actually digest or benefit from it in any way is debatable. But it's just really... This is just a funny, like, reaction. What the hell, Chris? Here, you hold on to this. You got the chalk. Wait, Chris, what the hell was that? Why would Noelle ask me to do homework with her? Death wish much? Does she want to fail? Look at her shaking Chris. And look at Chris's like two frames of animation. They're being shaked back and forth and it's just... This game is so funny, man. Like, it lowers your expectations with silly moments like this, and then it'll go full Photoshop Flowey on you when you're not looking. It's like, what a funny animation style. Wait a second. Chris, did you notice how nervous she was? And, like, blushing and stuff? Chris, you don't think she known to our secret identities? Yeah, and like, see here, instead of orange, her eyes are white. I guess when they're orange, the eyes are smaller. When they're white, they're larger. That would suggest that, yeah, she has white sclera and orange irises, meaning that she has human-style eyes. It's just that the iris is orange. Okay, yeah, I think that makes the most sense. Also, the whole secret identities thing is so silly. You know, this Dark World stuff. It's like, it's not a secret identity, Susie. I mean, I guess it is technically. Damn, we gotta keep this under wraps, Chris. This is our thing, you know. Anyway, enough waiting already, right? Let's go. Down, down, down. Very interesting animation. Because, like, you go through all those white squares or rectangles, suggesting, like, you're going through a portal of some sort, like a Stargate almost. And then as you're falling down, light shimmers and sparkles fly off of you up into the air as you transform into your Dark World forms. It's interesting. Very interesting. I have some theories regarding how the Dark World works with regards to why it changes our appearance. Like, why does Susie get more glowy, and like why does her hair become brighter, why does her skin become brighter, and why does Chris change colors entirely? They become blue? Because if you follow the logic looking at the other Lightners, like Noelle, Bardley, and Susie, they change colors, but they usually maintain their core color palette. They just become brighter or lighter, or like they just sort of shift. It's like if you had them in an editing software and you have like the different little tabs that you can use, the little sliders to change their like luminosity or change their vibrancy or whatever. It's like with the other the other Lightners, they're just shifting on one of those little sliders. But with Chris, they change entirely. They go from yellow skin to blue skin and brown hair to dark blue hair. It doesn't really make sense. So some people theorize, oh, it's because they're human. It works differently, and that might be the case, but I don't really buy it. All evidence suggests that humans and monsters are a lot more similar in this universe than they are in the Undertale universe. So Chris having such a drastically different transformation seems unlikely to me. I would suspect that it has to do with them having Asriel's soul inside them. I think it's because Chris is more than just a human or a monster. There's something special. So yeah, that's my theory on the topic. Let's see. Here's all the items I have left over from Chapter 1. Shadow Crystal. A sharp shadow moves like water in your hand. You've collected 1. You held the crystal up to your eye, but nothing happened. Interesting. Hey, Gast, are you still there, dog? Yeah? Uh-huh. A goose? That's crazy. Alright, thanks. We still got Spooky Blade, Amber cards, Brave Axe, Iron Shackle, Devil's Tail. Alright, yeah. Chris, level 2 bed inspector. Inspects all beds inexplicably. Level 2 Dark Knight. Does damage using dark energy. This is interesting, though, because I believe, we're level 2 now. And you go up to level 2 between Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, both you and Susie, no matter what. However, you are level 1 if you go to the pause menu in Chapter 1 before you leave the Dark World, but after you defeat King, you will still be level 1. It's not until after you seal the Dark Fountain and come back in this chapter that you are level 2. Now, some people theorized, oh, Chris is level 2 because they went and murdered someone in the night. But no, because we just saw in the Light World that we're still level 1. So Chris being level 2 here suggests that there's a different leveling system in the Dark World than there is in the Light World, which adds further credence to the idea that the Dark World and the Light World aren't just different places, but are dimensionally different. Like they're separate realities almost. At least enough to an extreme enough extent that you have different leveling systems. And Susie also becomes level 2. So, she's a Dark Knight, which is funny. Chris has guts as their main stat. Oh no, they both have guts, and they both have two little fireballs. Uh, Purple, yes. Rudeness, 89, which is down from the 99 or 100 that it was last chapter. 0 in the magic staff for Chris. You can change that with items, but you can't actually cast spells. Act. You can do many things. Don't confuse it with magic. Still important, still relevant. The fact that Chris can't use magic seems incredibly lore significant. Like, there's a reason that Chris can't use magic, presumably tied up with them being human, but we'll get to that later. Deals moderate, rude elemental damage to one foe, depends on attack and magic. Again, is a spell. No, yeah, these are labeled as spells, interestingly. So yeah, while I don't remember the specifics of our stats, I do believe that in Chapter 1, we had much different stats than we do in Chapter 2. The specifics of which... Let me double check. Yeah. So according to the wiki, like, their level goes up after they seal a dark fountain. Now, whether that's hyperbole or not hyperbole, conjecture, or whether or not it literally changes in the code, like it says, Dark World level goes up to level 2 when you seal a dark fountain. I'm not certain. I have not looked at the code myself. However, what we do know is that Chris's HP, attack, and guts all go up. Like, you'll notice that Chris here has 14 attack. That's partially because of the weapon they have equipped currently. Yeah, so if I had it back down, Woodblade gives no stat boost, so it just goes down to 12. But 12 is still higher than they had in Chapter 1, where they had 10. And you can actually, whenever you seal the Dark Fountain at the end of Chapter 2, presumably it does increase your level to level 3, because we have stats for it on the wiki. So like Chris's LV goes up to 14 or 15, Susie's, Noelle's, Realce's, etc. They all increase in various ways. So that's interesting. So it kind of raises some questions, though, about what LV is in the context of Deltarune, or in context of the Dark World. Because as we learn in the rest of this chapter, by fighting enemies, you can actually increase your stats. Specifically your health, I think. I don't know if your other stats increase. I think they do, though, now that I think about it. Let me double check. Yeah, you get increased HP. Yeah, defeating enemies and countering enemies, etc., it does increase your other stats. But even if it doesn't increase your level. And as far as we can tell, there's no EXP system in the Dark World, unlike in the Light World. It's just either you're level 2 or you're level 3. It depends on the number of Dark Fountains sealed. So that makes you wonder if LV stands for something different in the Dark World. Something related to Dark Fountains. I wonder what it could be. And the fact that you gain LV and that makes you more powerful in the Dark World from sealing fountains suggests that you're gaining something when you seal them. Like maybe you absorb some of the power of the Dark Fountain when you seal it. Maybe that's how you seal it, is that you absorb up its power. Something like that, which is interesting. Because that could suggest that Chris and Susie might start to gain enough power to manifest magic in the Light World by the end of the game, which would be interesting. Because we know that in Undertale, like, even if the determination, save system, whatever, only works in the underground, if you become a god, that power carries over into the surface world. Because they mention outright that after Azrael absorbed Kara's soul, they were way more powerful and could have killed all the humans that were attacking them very easily. So that suggests that the power you gain from soul absorption or anything soul-related is permanent, even if you're not in the underground. So I guess the point I'm getting at is that maybe you are absorbing some sort of power when you seal the Dark Fountains. The only curious thing, though, is that Rouse levels up as well. Chris and Susie level got makes sense. They're present when the Dark Fountain is sealed. But why Rouse? Also, Susie, notably, she starts Chapter 1 at level 1, but she becomes level 2 rather quickly. Yeah, Noelle joins the party at level 1 and becomes level 2 after receiving any title, which is curious. So actually, yeah, that seems to prove that LV does not depend upon fountain ceiling. You get it from gaining a title. I don't know. That's curious. I can't quite guess what. There has to be some sort of conceptual, like, connection based power that they're tapping into? I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. This is hard. I'm not sure how the LV system works. Like, I have some ideas regarding how the Dark World works. I think it's very tied up with souls and energy and magic and stuff, and determination even. But it must have to do with absorbing power. And maybe Noelle is just more proficient at it than we expect. Because when we find Noelle, she's surrounded by bodies of, or not bodies, but craters of all the, presumably of her fighting off violently her other darkness. So maybe the reason Noelle levels up randomly is just because she's already killed so many enemies, or at least fought so many enemies that her stats have. Maybe there isn't. I guess what I'm saying is maybe there's a hidden EXP mechanic in the lore of Deltarune or in the Dark World of Deltarune, and you just, if you kill enough enemies, then maybe you can breach that threshold and level up that way. So maybe Noelle absorbed enough power from violence that eventually, just from the pacifist route, just from interacting, she can ambiently absorb enough power to reach level 2. I think that might be the only explanation that makes sense at this stage. And it would be the only explanation that makes sense for Rouse, because Rouse becomes more powerful as well. It's highly suspicious, by the way, that Rouse follows the same leveling system as us. And that... Well, actually, now that I think about it, there's the recruit menu. And I think the monsters are levels as well. Huh. Yeah, let's progress a little more. Here we are. Chris, Susie. It's been ever so long. Yeah. It's been what, a day? Oh, that is short, isn't it? It's just that I've never had friends before. So I've never waited so long to see them again either. Fine, guess we'll try not to let you die of loneliness. I bet Lancer wants to see us too, right? Hey, wait a second. Where is Lancer? Where's everybody? Worry not, Susie. You'll see them in a moment. Just wait here, alright? Okay. Hey, this better not be some kind of prank or something. Chris, I have something to ask you. I need you to return to the light world and go to the old classroom to the east of the closet doors. It almost feels superfluous to even talk about this anymore because I've already discussed Rouse at depth. But he is aware of the light world. He is aware of the layout of the school to an extent that suggests he has, which is a weird amount of knowledge that he has. Inside, gather everything on the ground and bring it back here, could you? Yeah. So, like, Rouse has a bizarre amount of knowledge of the way this world works and of the light world, which adds further credence to the idea that he's more than he seems. It doesn't seem very useful. Chris, go to the old classroom, bring everything back here. It's where you returned to the light world last time. Head east after you exit the dark world. So that's just Ralsea's knowledge that he shouldn't have. It looks like a shop, but the door's locked and no one's inside. It's locked. And then once you interact with one of these, it all says it's locked. Nothing really that special. It's interesting, though, because it's like sword and weapon here, in here, question mark, house. It gives the impression that this whole town is paper thin, and there's nothing real here. And it's not until we recruit other Darkeners that real stuff starts showing up. So, Rouse, you're not going to put your hat back on? Why? Did I look cuter before? No, I just mean... You think I look cuter now? It was just nicer seeing less of you. You're making me blush. That's a funny meta joke about Ralsei not wearing his hat anymore. Oh, I almost forgot. Ralsei's design changes in the portrait, and the overworld, his sprite has green glasses, whereas they're black in his character portrait. But more importantly, is his horns. They curl backwards and outwards. Like in his portrait, they curl outwards, whereas in his sprite, they curl in a different way. So like, if you look at it from behind, it looks like they curl inwards towards the center of his head. And then if you look at it from the side, they curl backwards. So they curl inwards and backwards on his sprite. Whereas they curl, and then from the front, in the character portrait, in the dialogue portrait, they curl outwards. Which is weird. I don't know if that counts as lore or in anything, or if that's just meant to be, or it's just a kind of like a, a quirk of the art style, You look upon the castle you first saw yesterday. You are filled with the power of immediate nostalgia. More jokes about the time that Deltarune has been away for the player. It is interesting how Chris gets power from these save points rather than getting, you are filled with power. Okay. So whereas in Undertale, you are filled with determination, and that determination is what makes you the dominant force in the save load system, and it's what lets you compete with Flowey, both as Omega Flowey and as his Hyperdeath form, and refuse to die. Whereas in this game, you are absorbing power. You are literally filled with the power of all the places you go to. That has to be how you level up. You are literally absorbing the power of the Dark World. And when you fight enemies, you get to absorb just a little bit more power than you would from encountering them normally. Okay, I think that makes the most sense. It has to work that way. Empty. Castle Town, LV2. I think on the first playthrough, you can find, it will say like Chris here, instead of LV, or instead of empty, implying that Chris took back control. But there's no evidence, but like the save time's the same, so it suggests they didn't actually go to the Dark World in any way. Interesting regardless. You look upon the castle, you feel the power of me installed. Hell are you going? Trying to have cake without me? So yeah, absorbing power seems like the most logical explanation. The rubble on the ground seems to have been dust and polish. Someone around here really cares about the details. That may or may not be a joke to, like, maybe this looks different than it did in the demo. I'm not sure. Or it's hinting at how this whole place is constructed by Ralsei to have a very particular aesthetic to it. Another Deltarune. And then if you go all the way over here, it seems to be locked. It may never open again. Which is interesting. This only goes to the another Deltarune on it, you'll notice. This goes to the Card Kingdom, which is interesting. Discuss that at length in another chapter. I don't have anything new to say here. However, funny enough, if you talk to this dummy... Actually, one second. Before I talk to the dummy, we talk to Susie one more time. Oh, they all changed positions. Yeah. Hurry the hell up, Chris. The longer you take, the longer I gotta spend with this weirdo. If you're bored, Susie, we could crochet some team scarves. Wait, crochet? Isn't that the game with the hammer? Or it's like knitting. Alright, as long as I get to use the hammer. I've never seen that dialogue before. That's funny. Huh. But the reason that I bother with that is that if you come over here and interact with the dummy, no one's looking. Hug the dummy. Hug. You hug the dummy. Nothing wrong with a little extra fluffiness in your life. You're all hugged out. Apparently, Rousey can see what's going on over here pretty easily. And so, when you come back, he's blushing and doesn't say anything. Sorry, just thinking. Perhaps we don't need that dummy anymore. Maybe you could just use the real thing. Yeah, very cute. Whether you want to read that through, platonic or romantic lenses is up to you. But it's cute regardless. Susie? So the hell were you hugging that Rousey statue? Let Chris do what they want, Susie. Also, it's not a statue. Just look at that Rousey face. That's funny. One moment. I have to take drugs. Alright, I'm back. Okay. Let Chris do what they want, Susie. Also, it's not a statue. The hell you even have a Rousey statue anyway? Susie wants to practice hugging too. Chris, hurry up already! So yeah, that's a cute little interaction you only get if you interact with the statue first. Continuing along. It's interesting. There's this light here that wasn't here before. Is that a plot thing? Is it... I noticed that it shrinks and grows in size. Like an orifice. Very strange. And all the sparkles floating up, kind of like the sparkles of, that fly off of you when you go up. It's interesting. Ring, ring. No one picked up. Oh, but yeah. If you look at our stats, we are once again level 1. Totally different stats in the live world. Yeah, that's right, because if you come down here, this doesn't seem like the way to the old classroom. That doesn't seem like the way to the old classroom. You ran the water fountain. It's lukewarm. It's tepid. It's refreshingly cool. Do you like breathing? Moving fast with or without legs? But usually with legs? Join the cross-country team with Jockington and Noelle. Which is really funny, because Jockington does not have legs and Noelle does. So yeah, you can go through all these places and it doesn't work. Also, the school's layout is another place that doesn't make any sense when you actually look at it. What's funny is if you nudge forward slightly, there's actually a text box that you can just barely interact with. I forget what it actually says. Oh yeah, it's if you can just barely click on it, it says you stared at the checkerboard from the doorway. So yeah, you gathered all of the junk off the floor and turned it into a giant dusty ball. Also, this clock says 6:30, which is strange. The door's locked. Managed to cram everything into the closet, even the rug. So I guess everything that, except for the stuff you're carrying got put in here. Yeah, and then there's a picture of Alvin on the poster that represents King's Castle, which is obviously very suspicious. Ah, Chris, you're going to do your project? Oh, are you calling to ask for my help? I'll go find our homemade scented glue sticks. Oh, you have a partner this time? Chris, that's wonderful. I hope they like butterscotch scented glue sticks. Click. Notably, I just realized this is call Toriel. Before it said call home. Interesting. So when it says call home, you're calling the home phone. When it says call Toriel, you're calling Toriel's cell phone. I think. And the reason that's interesting is because if you go down here, yep, there they are. And how is Chris doing? They're great, Tori. One of my favorite students, a real star. One of her favorite students is the one that's silent, sleeps through most of the class, and gets third place in grades. Oh, how wonderful. They have not been up to anything strange. Ah, no, they're normal. Well, that is relieving. I have just been a little concerned lately. Just lately? Interesting. That suggests that Toriel. Well, one, it suggests that Chris has always been a bit strange, a bit odd. Long before anything strange, like suspicious, started happening. Supernatural suspicious. But Toriel has started to pick up that something strange is going on with Chris. Uh, and not just since in the last 24 hours. Something strange has been going on with Chris for some time, suggesting something has changed in the recent past. Now, I suppose Chris is the Night Truthers would argue that, oh, there's some big backstory about Chris that we haven't been told yet, and that will explain their motivation for opening Dark Fountains, blah, blah, blah. However, I think that's not any more unbelievable than Chris having a very specific motivation for being strange lately. And, well, I don't know. I think it's just more compelling if it has something to do with Azrael and Azrael being dead. But that's just me. You take it easy too, Alphys. I am always cheering you on, all right? The thanks. Of course, Alphys blushes because she presumably has a crush on Toriel as well, since, obviously. Can't let Mom find out you're balancing a giant trash orb. However, you can't go down any further. You can use your cell phone to call Toriel. Ring, ring. Oh, excuse me. I seem to be receiving a phone call. Chris, what is it, honey? What? You are normal? Could you explain what you mean by that? Chris, don't give the phone to me. Oh, you are going to the library later? Well, thank you for telling me this time. Have a nice time. Click. So, yeah, okay. Yeah, so obviously the phone doesn't tell us every number that we can call. We can clearly call either Toriel's cell phone or the home phone, and those are different numbers, and it says something different when we're calling one or the other, but we don't have both options at all times. It's like the game, or Chris perhaps, only lets us be aware of certain options. I don't think it makes sense for it to be Chris. I think the only explanation is that this is just a gameplay limitation or gameplay choice. Chris, do not worry about the library. Click. It's funny, she clearly turns. Interesting. Yeah, okay. I think I've explored everything I can. And then we land in the middle of the castle town this time, which is weird. Because sometimes when we go in through the doors, we end up in the cliffs to the west. And sometimes we end up in the south of the town. Sometimes we end up in the middle of the town. So that suggests to me that entering the Dark World is not an exact science. It's like you enter it and you'll enter that Dark World, but where in the Dark World you'll end up will vary. Which makes sense because it seems like, when we go to the cyber world, Chris and Susie enter at the same time, which is why they land in the same place. But Birdley and Noelle clearly ended up somewhere different. Well, maybe. I don't know. The logic of it's a little unclear. Everyone? Guess who's back, clowns? Lancer! I'm gonna turn the volume down a little bit again. Yeah, the audio's just a bit high. Lancer! I like how he runs out of animation frames near the end. Hey Chris, don't know what you did, but hell yeah. Everyone's here. But what happened to Lancer's castle? All gone. Gone? Right. When Chris sealed the fountain, that dark world disappeared and turned back into a normal classroom. So where's Lancer gonna live now? Don't worry, Susie. We'll conquer Rousey's castle as our own. Chris, as you bring Dark World denizens back here, the power of our fountain will transform this town more and more. From now on, the enemies we spare will be recruited to our town. So let's keep sparing enemies, okay? It's interesting, the discussion of power. Because, if we absorb power to become stronger, then could it be that Rousey's collecting all these Darkeners in one place to sacrifice them to gain power? Or something like that? I don't know. Hard to say. Or maybe Rousey is collecting them in preparation for all the possible routes, figuring that Chris will need as many friends and sources of power as they can get, regardless of which route they go down. And so Rousey just wants to make sure Chris has many resources as possible, regardless of whether they want to go the evil or good routes. Why don't we all have a look around? We can head north towards the castle. I have a special surprise to show you there. Ahaha, not if I surprise myself first. Last one there is a fresh and fragrant egg. Come on, Chris, you gonna let him beat us? And now we have Rousey, who whose sweetness is quite high. Has their sweetness gone down between in chapter 1 their stat is kindness and it's at 100. In chapter 2 their stat becomes sweetness and it's at 97. Presumably it's Susie rubbing off on him. Dark World being. He has friends now. Spare a tired enemy by putting them to sleep. Heavenly Light restores a little HP to one party member. It depends on magic. The idea that Rousey has access to some sort of heavenly power is still a very interesting idea. Okay, yeah, I've been recording for an hour and a half, so I think I will cut the recording here and continue with the exploration in the next recording session. So, see y'all in a second.